College football nerds here coming at you with a top 10 on Tuesday. And as you know, or as you have come to love this segment as much as we have, it means that we're going to talk ball. We're going to give you our top 10 for sure, but we're also going to talk just some interesting talking points around college football, which might mean that it goes a little long. But y'all have been around the block enough with us to know that that's okay, and that's what we do. I got Josh with me. He's going to get nerdy with y'all as well. And Josh, I would love to hear from you what your top 10 is looking like.
My top 10 this week, as always, it's kind of hard. There's a lot of schedules yet to be played, but just running through it quickly before we do our discussion. Number 1, I have Oregon. Number 2, Georgia. Number 3, Texas. Number 4, Ohio State. Number 5, Clemson. Number 6, Miami. Number 7, Penn State. Number 8, Tennessee. Number 9, Texas A&M. And number 10, I have Indiana. What do you have, Daniel?
Yeah, I love the numbers for the podcast listeners. And I want to apologize to y'all because I didn't get it out last week, and that was on me. All right, number 1 for me is Oregon. Number 2, Georgia. Texas at number 3. Ohio State, Clemson, Indiana. At number 7 is Penn State. Number 8, Miami. Number 9, Tennessee. Number 10, Texas A&M. Josh, I want to start with a discussion about Indiana. You struggled putting them in there at all. And I think, last week we talked about it, I had them in my top 10. And my main argument is if you replace the logo with someone else, there would get some weight there. But right now there's so much weight that's going to their admittedly weak schedule. And I think people are overlooking what kind of team you got to be to blow the doors off of everybody. I don't think anybody in our top 10 has gone as cleanly against lesser competition through the course of their schedule. Not Oregon, not Georgia, not Texas. Like, you have to go all the way down the list. None of them have blown everybody out that they've played that are weak. And I'm not saying Georgia versus Texas. I'm saying if you take all the weak teams on Georgia's schedule, they haven't blown them all out. Struggle with Kentucky. There's a joke about Alabama in there somewhere. So I ask you this question because Penn State is ranked like number 3 in the AP poll. They're super up there. On a neutral field today, who would you take, Indiana or Penn State?
You always give me the easy questions. I mean, it's tough. I mean, if you look at something like FPI, it has Penn State just slightly ahead of Indiana. I would pick Penn State narrowly, not by a ton. I'm not sure what Indiana would do, but here's the thing is, I think Indiana's offense has been very effective against everyone. All Indiana has done is basically line up and beat people badly every single week. They had some hiccups with Washington, but I also think Penn State's a completely different animal than Washington is. But Daniel, I'll spin it back around to you to explain why I struggle with putting Indiana any higher. Strength of schedule and FPI. And we can talk about FPI's SOS. It has issues. I'm not denying that. SOS to date, strength of schedule to date, Indiana is 106th in the country. In the ranked AP teams, that is the lowest strength of schedule of any ranked team outside of Army. Period. Like and when I'm including there, like Boise State, SMU, Kansas State have much harder schedules to date than Indiana does. To your point, Daniel, on like would I pick them to beat Penn State? My problem is I really have no clue whether or not they would beat Penn State at this point. Now, the good news, if you're Indiana, the remaining strength of schedule is 17th, which is pretty darn good because you have to play, rest of the season you're going to play Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, in with Purdue, which isn't terribly hard. But those 3 games will give us some data points. Now, if they drop, let's say 2 of those, a 10-2 Indiana team is not going to be very good, frankly, compared to a 10-2 team with a much harder schedule because it could be much harder. But right now, before having played those games, I still don't really know what to do with Indiana because I think you go through FIU, Western Illinois, UCLA, Charlotte, Maryland, Northwestern, especially those first 6 games, Daniel, I would say probably 2/3 of the SEC, probably half the Big Ten would go through 6-0 with that schedule without having had a close game. Nebraska and Washington are a little harder, but again, at least half the SEC, at least the top third of the Big Ten would beat those two teams handily. Maybe not 56-7 over Nebraska. We just saw a version of that right this past Saturday, but it's not that much of an accomplishment. And so as much as I know that's dinging Indiana, when you have a schedule that's that weak, that consistently, I know we always say beating bad teams consistently is a mark of a great team. This isn't just like Clemson over a weak ACC, Daniel. The problem is the bottom half of the Big Ten, we've talked about this a lot, is really, really bad. In fact, about the whole bottom of the Big Ten, the only team in the SEC that's comparable is Mississippi State. The top half of the Big Ten is great and can play with anybody in the SEC, but there's this huge divide in the conference, and the schedule that Indiana has happens to play that group. And I'll spin it around to you, Daniel. The other one that I think you have to consider that's also undefeated is BYU. And for the consideration for BYU to that same point, they have a really weak schedule, but, if Indiana's 106th, BYU's strength of schedule is 55th. And so just to put in comparison, I mean, the divide, I know it sounds like bad name teams. The bad name teams in the Big 12 are still like twice as hard as what Indiana's played because they've played the worst teams in the Big 10. The trick is the remaining strength of schedule for BYU is 52nd, whereas Indiana is 17th. So there's a big divide there, I think, as it goes through the rest of the season. Indiana will kind of prove themselves out hard one way or the other, whereas BYU can float through and continue to beat average opponents and will never play anybody all that much better.
The one thing that really gives me pause, because I think that, while you were talking, I was thinking through Indiana, and my concern of them being a paper tiger would be around them not having an offense that scales. But Nebraska's defense is actually really good this year. Their offense has been a problem that has led to some points like in the Illinois game, but gave up 7 to Rutgers, 10 to Purdue, 21 to Ohio State, 10 to Colorado, and then they play Indiana and lose 56-7. I can't overlook that. I just can't. I think that you're right that with this schedule, half the SEC teams out there are undefeated, but I don't think they're beaten. I don't think half the SEC teams are beaten in Nebraska 56-7. That's tough for me because, like you said, they could go 10-2. I don't know what that looks like, given how, and we maybe touched on this a little bit later, that I think that there's going to be some 11-1, 10-2 teams out there that maybe don't get into the playoffs just because there's going to be more than normal in this year. Speaking of highly ranked teams and teams in our top 10, I'm a little bit surprised that Texas has fallen to 6th in the AP poll. I think it's funny because we've got Miami now ahead of Texas, and we've got Ohio State at number 4. Ohio State and Texas are both have one loss, and I get that Ohio State's loss was closer, but the Miami one is struggling. I struggle with that, Josh, because I don't think I had them in my top 10 last week. They did win comfortably in a rivalry game up against a bad team. I think they're getting a little bit healthier. But, Josh, how do we look at Texas at 7-1, who has played Georgia, who went on the road to play Michigan, juxtaposed against a Miami team that beat Louisville by 1 score, that needed a miracle from the refs to beat Cal, gave up 38 to Cal, needed a miracle from the refs to beat Virginia Tech. I feel like we're doing a little bit of the recency thing, and they've gotten, like, the voters have sort of forgotten that Miami played those crappy games, and now that they've beaten up on a terrible Florida State team, all is forgiven.
Yeah, I can't really justify it myself. I mean, when you talk about Texas and what they've done early in the season, they were the dominant, no question, number 1 team because they thumped Michigan, destroyed Colorado State, UTSA, Louisiana Monroe, blew out Mississippi State, blew out 34-3 Oklahoma, who was ranked at the time. Then they lose by 15 points to Georgia, and they have a close game against a ranked Vanderbilt. Let's be clear. Vanderbilt is probably better. Daniel would agree. Vanderbilt is better, not just than anyone Miami's played. Vanderbilt is probably better than anyone on Miami's schedule. True or false?
Yeah, because I hate to say this, Josh, but at least how they're playing now, and I think they're a better team than they were at the beginning of the year, Florida might be the best team on their schedule.
Right. And, I'm not even sure. I'm actually clicking on this because I'm not sure right now. Florida does not play Vanderbilt this year. We won't get an answer to that question. I didn't think that was the case. So, it's either going to be Florida or Vandy. I know they blew out Florida, but Florida played really, really bad at the beginning of the year. They've kind of turned it around. You can make a statement about whether that's just SEC play being weak. I don't think it is because of what Florida looked like even in SEC play early versus how they look at right now. But I can't buy it. I mean, Texas goes through, looks completely dominant. Miami has looked winning by the skin of their teeth over and over and over again, and yet we reward them and jump over Vandy. And I think a lot of it, Daniel, is the fact that people cannot accept the fact that Vanderbilt is a legitimately good team. I'll bring another team in the mix we were talking about before we started recording. You look at FPI rankings, you look at FEI rankings. Vanderbilt right now is 47th in FEI. That's the Fremo Efficiency Index, right? BCF Toys, Brian Fremo, good friend of the channel. Always love his stats. Illinois is 48th, and we get Illinois a ranked Big Ten team. You look at FPI, and I started there because everybody's convinced that FPI is somehow massively biased. Illinois is 55. Vanderbilt's 37th. Vandy is better than Michigan right now, who's 39th. Better than Washington in FPI, was 41st. And I joke, but FPI has been around with this formula long before this was all the SEC was on there. And to the extent you use recruiting rankings, that really doesn't help Vandy. So the point being, Vanderbilt is a legitimately good team. I mean, it's compared to all these teams, if you had a close win over Illinois or Michigan or Washington, would that be punished the same way? And if you look at ACC teams that, who you're actually comparing it to, I'm just like going down the list here. Like North Carolina is 57th, Maryland 59th compared to Vandy. Vandy is 3 spots behind Cal, only 5 spots behind Pitt in the ACC, according to FPI. So, I mean, to drop Texas, I think is beyond silly. I mean, I just think that was just flat out a screw up by the AP poll. It doesn't make any sense in any way, shape, or form to me. And yeah, I mean, we'd had this whole conversation about a lot of stuff, right? We are still latched on to preseason rankings, and you beat teams we thought were good, so we're going to rank you because we thought they were good when you beat them. The whole idea with the undefeated Illinois being ranked where they were, I kept saying was silly because, even at the time they were like 55th in most advanced metrics. I mean, there was a lot of reason when they beat Nebraska that they shouldn't have been ranked where they were. They lose to Penn State, and then Penn State gets this huge marquee win. And I'm sorry, I just don't think it's a marquee win. But at the same time, Texas over Vanderbilt apparently doesn't count for anything. I don't get it, Daniel. Just running through all of it, we are still, from an AP poll perspective, really married to win-loss records, records of these teams, compared to where we thought they were in the preseason and how many ranked teams you beat based on preseason polls. You know this, Daniel, better than anyone, my point. I'll let you talk on it, but I have long believed that, yes, you have to evaluate a given team on its record and who it played. But when you talk about who you played, you should be talking about the quality ratings of who you played. The FPI, the FEI ratings. It does not matter if you played an undefeated team that is not rated very high. I care about the quality of your opponent, right? I don't care if you played a team that Notre Dame that lost a really stupid game to Northern Illinois has to be ranked according to that. And that's the only reason they're not higher in our rankings. From an overall quality team perspective, if you were to beat Notre Dame right now, that is probably a top 10 quality team. I mean, would you agree with that? And that's always the way that I think through things in terms of rankings.
Yeah, I struggled not putting them in my top 10. My issue with Notre Dame right now, and it's funny because I feel like the AP voters are doing the opposite with Notre Dame, and they're giving them a lot of credit for, since Northern Illinois lost, they've done the Indiana thing and crushed people except for their 1-score win over Louisville, but they ain't played nobody. I'm sorry, Louisville's not a good football team. They're just not. And I think a lot of, Miami beating Louisville, Notre Dame beating Louisville, a lot of people are getting credit for beating a team that's just not very good. Looking at Vanderbilt's schedule, I think they have 7 or 8 teams on their schedule that are better than the best team on Miami's schedule. And the thing is, out of that 7 or 8, 3 or 4 of them are a lot better than the best team on Miami's schedule. Like, they've got several top 10 quality teams, and the best team on Miami's schedule is like probably like the 40th best team in the country. So you're right, it's going to be hard because Vanderbilt might not make a bowl, but might be a top 25 quality team this year. Enough about Vanderbilt. People are tired of that, and they probably think that we're being a little bit ridiculous. Josh, let's talk a little bit about this as we wrap this up. I have this thought in the back of my mind that, and I could be totally wrong, but you put out a tweet today, and I'll let you set that up after I ask this question. But your tweet centered around how many teams and who will get in based on what your record is now, or might be this year and historically. I have a concern because of this consolidation of teams into super conferences, into the Big Ten and the SEC, paired with the fact that we have to give the ACC a bid, we have to give the Big 12 a bid, and a G5 a bid, and probably Notre Dame a bid. I think there are going to be multiple 10-2 teams that get left out, and historically, no 10-2 team would have ever been left out of a 12-team playoff, even with that G5 mandate.
So the tweet I put out as I went through historically and tried to look at what happened when a 10-win team or 9-win team from the SEC or the Big Ten, looking at who was in those conferences at the time, was considered for the playoff before it was a 12-team playoff. I did it based on being top 11 because the 12th team is probably going to be a G5 under the... Look, it may have been Cincinnati back in the day, but Cincinnati is a Big 12 team. The reality is that fifth slot, which formerly was the sixth slot, has gone to a weaker team than was ever envisioned. People have not really fully processed just how bad that is with realignment and just how bad that fifth team is going to be. Again, where it used to be that it was always planned to be a Cincinnati or UCF, who was at least a viable team, it's going to be much worse now. Maybe even not a top 25 quality team. But if you looked at Big Ten and SEC teams ranked top 11 from 2014 through 2023, based on the college football playoffs rankings at the end of December, teams that finished the regular season 10-2, so I'm including losses in the conference championship in that group, were 19-8 in terms of being top 11. That was 70% of SEC and Big Ten teams made it. Teams that went 9-3 in the regular season were 3-11, so 21%. So it's pretty obvious 10 wins is the margin. It is possible to get in with 3 wins, but it's hard. It takes really a couple things. It takes a low number of 10-win teams, and it takes a really good schedule. 2 of the 3 9-win teams that made it in the same year, and that was the only year where there was only one 10-2 team from the SEC or Big Ten. Everybody else was undefeated or 11 wins. So it's all about a little bit the field. The other thing I noted, Daniel, though, was it was 19-8. All 8 of the teams that did not make the playoff from the Big Ten and SEC came from the Big Ten West or the SEC East. I think Iowa failed to make it 3 times of the 8. I know Minnesota didn't make it one year. Wisconsin didn't make it. I know one year Florida didn't make it. So what you end up with there is really an acknowledgement that those 2 divisions had much weaker schedules than the other. And there were several times where you had a 10-2, like Iowa, that played in the conference championship game, lost, and then got bounced out of the top 11, ended up 12th, 13th, or 14th. And so to that point, Daniel, it was pretty clear to us in the past that we knew these divisions were weak, and we recognized this schedule is weaker than another schedule. To your point, Daniel, I think there's 2 problems that are raising. One, with more teams in these conferences, it's more opportunity for somebody to go 10-2 and to crowd that field. The other thing, Daniel, to me is, like we were talking about in this whole discussion with Indiana, I don't know if people have fully processed just how bad the schedule disparity is within the same conference, right? You know, we talked about strength of schedule for Indiana. Let me be clear, that's not some like huge ding on the Big Ten as a whole. When you look at some of the Big Ten teams, yeah, some of them do have pretty hard schedules. It just so happens that it's not true of specifically Indiana. I mean, Ohio State is 39th in the country in strength of schedule. That'll only get harder. Now, all of the Big Ten has this problem to some degree. They really like to backload the schedules at the conference level with the best teams playing the best teams at the end of the year. You know, Penn State, Ohio State, which we'll do a preview of this week. Ohio State, Michigan, all that kind of stuff. So it always ends up being weak to start with, heavier to finish. Oregon will finish with the 21st hardest strength of schedule, even though they're 63rd now. Ohio State's remaining strength of schedule is 14th, et cetera, et cetera. But to this point, I think what we're seeing is that even within the Big Ten, the difference between Ohio State or Oregon's schedule and Indiana's is just monumental. And I don't know until I see it how much the playoff committee is going to take that into account. And everybody I think nationally is worried about what happens when you have a 10-2 Big 12 team versus a 9-3 SEC or Big 10, and that's always a concern because they get tied up in win-loss. Daniel, I'm concerned when they have a 10-2 Indiana versus a 9-3, 9-3. I don't know, Penn State, Michigan, Oregon, whoever, because I think there's a real chance that a 9-3 team in the Big 10 may easily be better than a 10-2 team. And both from a playoff ranking standpoint and also from the way they do the conference championship participation, they have not done a very good job of recognizing just how disparate the schedules can be.
And super conferences have created this problem because you've got so many teams in a conference now, it's not just that they can't all play each other. You got 16, 18 teams in a conference. They can't play a lot of people. So let me set this up for you, and then you can react to it. Right now in the ACC, SMU doesn't play Miami or Clemson. Miami and Clemson don't play each other. So those teams are all undefeated in the conference. There's going to be some three-way tie potentially, but then you've got a team that hasn't played anybody that might get left out, and maybe it's Clemson, who hasn't beaten anybody since they lost to Georgia, really. And so you have a chance there to have 3 11-1 teams coming out of the ACC, a very good chance. Indiana, Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State can all finish 11-1 or 12-0, having only played each other as their one ranked team. I think Indiana gets one of them gets 2. Everybody else has one ranked team. So you have 4 teams out of the Big Ten that can all finish realistically 11-1 or 12-0, which means they've still got a buffer to lose another game and still be in that 10-2 space that you're talking about. SEC has 5 teams that can reasonably go 11-1 or 10-2, given the Alabama LSU is going to be an elimination game, so that knocks one of them out. Big 12, Iowa State, BYU, they don't play each other. Kansas State doesn't play BYU, so you're going to have another 3-way tie situation. That's two more teams or 3 more teams that can go 11-1, 10-2, and then the G5. I think the numbers are right that that's 16 teams at the end of the day. They're going to be 11-1, 10-2. Not even the 9-3 situation with a really tough schedule. I think there's a very good chance that a couple of these teams that are 11-1 or 10-2 are not as good as an 8-4 team from historically the Big Ten West or Big Ten East or SEC West, but they're going to make it into the playoffs over a team that's had a brutal schedule.
I think at some level that's just something you have to deal with. I mean, it's sort of the nature of where we're at with college football, the nature of realignment. I think this is everyone assumed that when you put these teams in the same conferences that you would get rid of this idea of we don't know who's better because they all play each other. And now what you're discovering is, well, they don't really all play each other because now there's 18 teams and you mix up the schedules. And like you're saying, everything gets sort of separated to the point where they don't necessarily play each other. An interesting game this week actually is Pitt SMU, because if SMU beats Pitt, to your point, Clemson becomes maybe their only losable game with Virginia, Louisville, and Boston College left. So this game may easily decide whether or not SMU. I'm sorry, that's actually Pitt's schedule. I'm looking at this backwards. From SMU's case, okay, yeah, this was exactly what I thought. It's just Boston College, Virginia, and Cal left. Good chance that if they beat Pitt, they're going to be 11-1 with the only loss being to BYU. They could be undefeated in conference play. Pitt plays Clemson. It's a mess. And I talked about those 10-2 things. That was just the Big Ten and the SEC. Because to be clear, there've been a number of 10-2 teams that get left out from other conferences, ACC, Big 12. And I think strength of schedule is going to become much more important. And it's an interesting point, Daniel, that I think there's this assumption of you want to keep a clean record. I don't think people have thought through what's going to happen when everybody has cleanish records, because the teams that played a harder schedule are going to have to be slotted higher. And there are going to be a lot of teams saying, hey, I went 11-1, I went 10-2, and I only got slotted here, or I didn't even make the playoff. It's like, yeah, you needed to play somebody better out of conference because they did and you didn't. And that stuff's going to really matter, especially when you're in one of the weaker conferences. So, it is what it is, and you're always going to have this problem. This is an argument people would say to move it to 16. But to your point, Daniel, you were talking about an 8-4 team from, let's say, the traditional Big Ten East might be better than a 10-2. Like SMU, I don't know how good they really are relative to SEC or Big Ten teams. I really don't. Nearly losing to Duke, close game to Louisville, lost to BYU, close game in the opener to Nevada. I don't really know how good SMU is at all compared to some of those teams. I think what the reality is we may get a really interesting sounding playoff field, and we may see a lot of blowouts, or depending on how it gets seeded, right? They may play each other. The bad teams play the bad teams, the good teams play the good teams. People still don't understand the seeding reality is going to be really, really weird because of the forcing all the champions to be in the top 4 slots means the rest of it gets seeded strangely. You're going to have rematches and things. But at some level, these teams are probably going to play, they're going to play Ohio State. They're going to play Texas or Georgia, and they're going to get the doors blown off them. And so what we're going to see is by like round 2 or round 3, it's going to look like a lot of the same old big names that you expected it to be. And that really interesting field, we just found out, had a bunch of pretenders. Moving it to 16, which would be people's argument, is not going to solve that problem. You're just going to include more teams that are more pretenders, and you're going to make it even easier. At that point, you are certainly including a lot of 9-3 teams. But it is what it is now, Daniel, and I think the reality is we're going to see, for example, the SEC go to a 9-team schedule sooner rather than later. They've kind of hinted at that. And a lot of this will be helped by just playing an extra game for more cross-pollination. But it is hard from a ranking standpoint, and frankly, it's hard from a stat standpoint. Collegefootballnerds.com, you can look at our rankings. We have a 1 through, still got to change that to 134. It actually does rank 134, but it says 133. It's looking pretty good now, right? I mean, we have Ohio State 1, Texas 2, Ole Miss 3, Indiana, Oregon, Tennessee, Alabama, Notre Dame, Miami, Iowa State, Army, Penn State, SMU down there at 13th, BYU down at 14th, Georgia, South Carolina, LSU on a row. I still don't know how much I buy that. Even with controls we try to put in place, there is not enough cross-pollination between the ACC and the other conferences for the computers to know what to do with it. I always say it's like looking at Polaroids of the Alps and the Himalayas. You can see this mountain's taller than this mountain in this photo, and this mountain versus this mountain in this other photo, but you don't know where those ranges are relative to each other. And that's the problem we have with our eyeballs and with the stats and with the nature of football, which is a relative sport. And it's just something we're going to have to deal with. To some degree, the playoff will sort it out, and to some degree, it might end up giving us a playoff that's a lot less interesting than we think it's going to be.
Conference realignment has also impacted this because you'd have Oregon in the Pac-12, maybe playing the second best team in the Pac-12, but they wouldn't be playing in the Big Ten championship, which means that drops down to you don't have this whole round robin of 4 teams vying for 2 slots, but you do have everybody, like if it was divisionless. Maybe you have Penn State, who would have a loss to Ohio State, playing again, right? Playing Ohio State again, which would knock them out if they lost again. Or you would be able to distribute losses more, force distribute losses against some of these better teams. Maybe Indiana gets in and gets a loss, and we get to see them play a real team. Indiana very well could kind of hide behind the fact that they haven't played anybody and still get left out of they could go undefeated and get left out of the Big Ten championship game and just get in that way, having not played anybody. Same thing with the Big 12. So you've got the SEC, who might have Texas in their conference championship instead of playing in the Big 12 championship against an Iowa State or a BYU and eliminating one of them. So it's really exacerbated the problem. And I do think, unfortunately, the answer probably is 9 or 10 conference games, which means we're going to see fewer and fewer big-time out-of-conference games, which means we're going to have a real hard problem judging these conferences at all. Because if you look at the Big 12 this year, I think they're 5-7 against 5-7 against Power 4 opponents. Only one of them is ranked, and that ranked win was BYU's 18-15 over SMU, which take that whatever. But the rest of them are all unranked, and they were all one-score wins. And then they lost 7 games. So we don't know what we don't know, and it's going to be even worse if teams stop playing each other out of conference, at least brand names.
Yeah, it is what it is. But hey, I mean, things will still mostly sort itself out. Texas A&M, LSU was a game for helping to sort this problem. Alabama will play LSU. That will help sort some things out. We never get LSU games right, so clearly even though we picked Texas A&M to beat LSU, that one doesn't count because I guess we picked LSU to lose. And yeah, it'll be what it'll be. It'll sort down to the final. And I did model the championship, Daniel, and right now it's got Eastern Carolina losing, unfortunately, to Vanderbilt 24-29. So, it's unfortunate that the Commodores come out on top of the Pirates, but that's the way it seems it's going to be.
All right, I think we're getting tired, and we still got another one to go, so we're going to have to wrap this one up as we circle the drain on our playoff discussion that went a little long, but that's okay because that one was kind of fun and interesting. Let us know what you think is going to happen at the end of the year. Is there going to be a logjam of historical 10-2 or maybe even 11-1 teams that get left out? And if you think that's the case, let us know what team or teams you would leave out if they went 10-2 or 11-1. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.